Welcome to the Code Navigators, your guide for, well, navigating the really complex standards of the International Code Council.
Our goal is pretty straightforward. We want to methodically walk through the key ICC code chapters.
Right, so whether you're studying for your certification exams or you just need to get a better handle on code compliance for your actual projects, we're here to help you get that edge.
We try to take all that dense regulatory language and just boil it down to what's most important.
And we don't just explain what the rule is, but also the why behind it, the philosophy, the practical challenges. We want you to be well-informed and fast.
And as we always do, we want to be transparent. This show is generated with help from artificial intelligence, which really helps us make sure we're accurate in covering all this material, but it's always overseen and reviewed by a human code professional. Before we jump in, we do have to cover something really important. This content is for educational and informational purposes only. It is absolutely not professional advice.
Yeah, please don't take this as a substitute for hiring an expert.
Exactly. You must always consult the official, current ICC code edition that's been adopted in your specific area and talk to a qualified professional, an architect, an engineer, a code official before you make any decisions based on this stuff.
That's really the foundation of building responsibly, isn't it? We're a study guide, a source for understanding the concepts, not your site-specific consultant.
And just a reminder to everyone listening, we are very strict about not stating any copyrighted material.
So when we mention tables or formulas, we'll tell you where to find them and what they do, but we will never read the specific numbers or percentages out loud.
Okay, so with that all said, today we're tackling a really critical chapter. We're getting into the IBC 2021 Chapter 11, which is all about accessibility.
And this is one of those chapters that comes up all the time. Lots of challenges, lots of misunderstandings in the field.
It really is.
Chapter 11 is so fundamental to, modern construction ethics. It's about making sure the world we build is usable by everyone. But when you look at it by itself, it feels like something's missing. Can you clarify that relationship between Chapter 11 and the other big standard, ICC A117.1?
That is the absolute most important thing to get straight right from the start. Think of IBC Chapter 11 as the scoping document.
The scoping document. Okay, what does that mean?
It basically answers the where and the what. It tells you, what kind of building needs to be accessible, what percentage of the hotel rooms need to comply, where does an accessible route need to start and end.
So it's the mandate. It's the law that says you must include this.
Precisely. And once Chapter 11 has told you what needs to be accessible, let's say it's 5% of the lockers or 2% of the apartments, that's where Chapter 11's job kind of ends.
And it hands it off.
It hands it off to ICC A117.1, which is called Accessible and Usable Buildings and Facilities. That's your technical standard.
So that's the how-to manual.
That's the perfect way to put it. It answers the how. How high does the grab bar have to be? How wide does the accessible stall need to be? What's the steepest slope you can have on a ramp?
I see. So they're totally inseparable. You need Chapter 11 to tell you how many, and then you need a 117.1 to get the actual dimensions right.
You must use both. You can't claim you've complied with one without the other.
Okay, let's unpack that framework then, starting at the beginning.
Okay.
Section 1101, scope, and 1102, compliance. What's the big philosophical idea here?
Well, Section 1101 really lays down the law. It says that all buildings, facilities, and their sites have to be designed and constructed to be accessible to people with physical disabilities.
So the philosophy is basically universal design. Accessibility is the default, not an extra feature you bolt on later.
It's the baseline, absolutely. And that means if you want to deviate from that, the burden of proof is on you.
So accessibility is the rule, and any inaccessibility has to be justified by a very specific written exception right there in the code.
That is exactly the mindset you need to have, whether you're an inspector or a designer. If the code doesn't explicitly say an area is exempt, then it has to be accessible.
And Section 1102 just hammers that home.
It does. It requires mandatory compliance with this chapter and that reference standard, a 117.1. Without that standard, you can't even claim you've met the requirements of Chapter 11.
Okay, now we get to Section 1103, scoping requirements. This is where it gets real, saying that everything, sites, buildings, elements, spaces, even temporary ones, has to be accessible.
Yes, 1103.1 is that big blanket statement. But 1103 is also where you find all the crucial exceptions.
And the exceptions are where the real studying comes in.
If you're prepping for an ICC exam, or if you're a designer trying to manage a project's complexity, these exceptions in 1103 are where you need to focus your time. They draw the lines in the sand.
Let's hit some of the big ones. We always get questions about just regular houses.
Right. That would be Section 1103.2.3, dwelling units and sleeping units. The major exception here is for detached one and two family dwellings and their accessory structures like a shed or a garage.
So a standard single-family home.
Generally, yes, those are exempt from this chapter's requirements. The code recognizes that those are private spaces with very limited public access.
Okay, that makes sense. What about things like utility buildings, places that don't really have people in them, just equipment or cars?
That's Group U occupancies, which is Section 1103.2.4. So, utility buildings, garages, carports, some farm buildings, they are generally exempt.
But there's a catch.
There is a huge catch. They are not exempt if they are open to the general public or if they contain required accessible parking spaces.
So my private garage at my house is exempt, but a public parking garage downtown is definitely not.
Absolutely not. The second the general public can walk in, that exemption goes right out the window.
Let's talk about the work areas exception. That's Section 1103.2.20. This one always seems to cause confusion on big commercial projects. What exactly is required in an employee-only area?
This is maybe the most nuanced exception in the whole chapter. The intent is to make sure an employee with a disability can get to their work area and get out safely. But it doesn't mean every single little aisle has to be fully accessible.
Okay, so let's start with what is required then.
Employee work areas have to comply with 4 critical things: the fire alarm rules from Chapter 9, the exiting rules from Chapter 10, the accessible route to the work area, and the vertical access rules.
So you have to be able to get there and get out in an emergency.
That's the priority. Now, for the circulation paths within that work area, like narrow aisles in a stockroom or the space between machines, that's where the exemption can apply.
And what are the conditions for that?
Those paths are generally not required to be accessible routes if the area meets one of 2 conditions. First, if the area is less than 1,000 square feet. Or, second, if the area has an elevation change of less than 7 inches, either up or down.
Ah, the 7-inch rule. That number pops up all over the code. It's like a magic threshold where accessibility rules suddenly kick in.
It is. It's basically the maximum rise of a single step before you'd need a landing or a ramp. It defines what the code considers a minor, manageable change in elevation.
So practically speaking, if I have a big factory floor, the little paths between the machines are probably exempt. But if there's a catwalk or a loading dock that's higher than 7 inches, the path to it have to be accessible.
You got it. That clears up so much confusion.
Are there other big occupancy types with exemptions we should flag?
Yes, religious and detention facilities. Section 1103.2.8 is for areas of religious worship.
Like an altar or a pulpit?
Exactly. If a raised or lowered area like that is less than 300 square feet and it's not elevated more than 7 inches, and it's primarily used for religious ceremonies, it's exempt.
So a small platform for a pastor might not need a ramp, but a huge choir loft probably would.
That's the logic. And then for detention facilities, Group I3, that's 1103.2.13. Areas used only by inmates or security staff are exempt.
Unless they're the actual cells.
Right, unless they are the specific holding cells or housing units that are required to be accessible. We'll get to those percentages later. But general staff areas are exempt because access is, fundamentally restricted for security reasons.
And what about just like mechanical rooms?
Those are covered in 1103.2.9. Equipment spaces that are only used by service people for maintenance or repair are exempt. These aren't places employees go as part of their daily job.
Okay, so we've got the scoping down. Let's move into the actual logistics of getting around.
Yeah.
The accessible route, Section 1104. This is that continuous, clear path through a facility.
Exactly. And Section 1104.1 defines it as the required path from all your site arrival points to the building's entrance.
Site arrival points, so that means the parking space, the bus stop, the public sidewalk.
All of them. If you drive, the route starts at your parking space. If you take the bus, it starts at the stop. If you walk, it starts at the curb cut.
So if a designer puts in perfect accessible parking stalls, but forgets to put in a compliant sidewalk from the parking lot to the front door, they failed.
They have completely failed the accessible route requirement. The continuity is absolutely critical.
And that continues inside the building too, right?
Yep. Section 1104.3 makes that clear. Any part of a building that needs access has to be connected inside and out all the way back to the public street. You can't have like an island of accessibility that you can't get to.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for a lot of people. Section 1104.4, multi-story buildings. When do we get to skip putting in an elevator? This is a classic exam question.
It is. This section lays out the exceptions to the rule that every single story and mezzanine has to be connected by an accessible route.
What's the easiest one?
The first and most simple exception is for structures with 4 or fewer dwelling units. So small residential buildings are generally exempt from providing vertical access inside the building.
And for non-residential buildings, how do we figure out if a second story or a mezzanine needs an elevator or a lift?
The code gives a few key exceptions here. For mezzanines, an accessible route is not required if that area is less than 3,000 square feet.
3,000 square feet. That seems pretty generous, but I feel like there's a big but coming.
There is a huge one. That 3,000 square foot exception is only valid if that area does not house certain high traffic occupancies. Specifically, it can't be a Group B business, a Group I institution, a Group R1 hotel, or a Group A4 assembly space like a museum.
So let's say a restaurant, which is a Group A2, has a small upstairs dining area, maybe 2,500 square feet. They'd still need an elevator.
They absolutely would. Even though it's under 3,000 feet, it's a Group A occupancy. The whole point is that if the public is expected to use that space for the main purpose of the business, you can't compromise on accessibility no matter the size.
So that exception is really for, like, secondary storage or a small office space that's not open to the public.
That's the primary target, yes. Incidental low traffic uses.
Are there any other exceptions based on size?
There are. If you have a 2-story building where one of the stories has an occupant load of 5 or fewer people, that story is exempt from needing vertical access.
So a tiny private office above a little shop.
Exactly. It's meant for truly small operations. And of course, equipment maintenance areas, which we already talked about, are also exempt.
Okay, let's move on to section 1105, accessible entrances. What's the general rule here?
The code requires that at least 60% of all public entrances must be accessible. This is to make sure that in a large building with multiple doors, a person using a wheelchair isn't forced to go all the way around to some back service entrance.
And what about power-operated doors? Section 1105.1.1. This isn't just a luxury anymore, is it?
Not at all. In buildings with a lot of public traffic, power-operated doors are mandatory for the required accessible entrances.
And how is that determined?
Table 1105.1.1 dictates it based on the occupancy type and the occupant load. The rule of thumb is that it usually kicks in when the occupant load hits 300 or more for busy assembly spaces, or 500 or more for places like offices or apartments.
Why that threshold?
It's all about managing flow. A building designed for 300 to 500 people is going to have peak times where a manual door would just be a huge bottleneck, especially for people with limited mobility.
And are there any entrances that are exempt?
Yes, entrances that are restricted, like those that lead only into a parking garage, or entrances used only by inmates in a jail, those are exempt. Also, security barriers like turnstiles are allowed as long as there's an accessible gate right next to them where someone can still maintain eye contact with the security guard.
All right, so once we're through the door, the next thing is dealing with vehicles. That brings us to section 1106 on parking.
Parking is a classic test subject, and honestly, a frequent source of mistakes out in the real world. Section 1106.2 is very clear. You have to follow this section, and you have to follow ICC A117.1 for all the dimensions, the striping, the signage.
And the number of spaces you need comes from table 1106.2.
That table is your best friend. You take the total number of parking spaces in your lot, and it tells you the minimum number of accessible spaces you need. It's pretty simple for small lots, and then it becomes a percentage-based formula for larger ones.
Now, a really important point. Not all accessible spaces are the same. Let's talk about van accessible spaces in section 1106.6.
This is a requirement you absolutely cannot forget. For every 6 required accessible parking spaces, at least one of them has to be van accessible.
And that means it's wider, right?
It's wider, and critically, it needs a minimum vertical clearance of 7 feet. That's 7 feet along the route to the space, in the space itself, and in the access aisle next to it.
And that 7-foot clearance is for the lifts and other equipment on specialized vans.
Exactly, and that's a really common issue in parking garages, where you have low-hanging beams or pipes that can get in the way.
Section 1106.7 is about location and dispersion. You can't just stick all the accessible spots in the back corner of the lot, can you?
No, you cannot. The rule is that accessible parking has to be on the shortest accessible route to the building entrance, period. And if you have multiple accessible entrances, the spaces have to be dispersed to serve those entrances.
It's about giving people choice and
It
convenience.
is. Now, there is an exception for multi-level parking garages. The van accessible spaces are allowed to be clustered on a single level as long as that level has an elevator or some other accessible route. It's a practical recognition that getting that 7-foot clearance on every single level can be tough.
Let's touch on loading zones and then move on to EV charging.
Okay, passenger loading zones, section 1106.9. If you provide them, you have to provide an accessible one right next to it. For really long loading zones, like at an airport, you need an accessible section for every 100 linear feet.
And what about the new kid on the block? Electrical vehicle charging stations in Section 1107.
This is an area of the code that's evolving really fast, but the 2021 IBC has clear rules in 1107.2. It says that for each type of EV charger you provide, level 1, level 2, DC fast charge, at least 5% of those spaces must be accessible.
And accessible means it has to meet those van accessible dimensions.
It does. It has to have that minimum width of 132 inches and a length of 240 inches to make sure there's enough room for the charger, the car, and the person.
And I see a note about gas stations, too.
Yes, Section 1107.3 requires fuel dispensing positions to be accessible, which usually means the controls are within reach and that assistance must be provided if someone requests it.
Okay, this next part, Section 1108, is probably the most demanding part of the chapter, especially for people studying. It's all about Type A and Type B dwelling units. Let's start with the basic difference between the two.
This is a crucial distinction. They represent two different tiers of accessibility in housing.
So let's start with the highest level, Type A units, in Section 1108.2.
Type A units are designed to be fully accessible and adaptable. They have to meet the strictest technical requirements in A117.1. We're talking accessible counter heights, full maneuverability in every room, specific layouts for kitchens and bathrooms.
They're ready to go.
They're ready to go. They're required in common use areas and in a smaller percentage of units to ensure maximum usability is available.
And then there's Type B units, Section 1108.3.
Type B units are required in a much larger number of the total units, but they meet a lower technical standard. They're often called visitable units.
Visitable. I like that.
It means they provide basic, essential access. A wheelchair user can get in the front door, get through the interior doors, use at least one bathroom, and get into the kitchen. The kitchen and bathroom might not be fully functional for them, but there's enough space to get in and maneuver.
So the idea is to make a really high percentage of our housing stock at least basically usable for someone with a mobility issue.
That's the strategy.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty percentages for different occupancies, starting with Group I, the institutional ones.
Right, let's look at Group I1, which is assisted living, and I2, which is hospitals and nursing homes. Section 1108.5 lays out the percentages.
But I'm seeing a huge difference here between Group I2, Condition 1, and Condition 2. One says 10%, the other says 50%.
That's a key distinction. Group I2 Condition 1 facilities are places like hospitals where you have short-term surgical or acute care. Patients aren't expected to be there long-term. In those places, at least 10% of the patient rooms have to be accessible.
In Condition 2.
Condition 2. Two facilities are nursing homes, long-term care facilities. Places where residents are likely to have long-term mobility needs. Because that's the baseline expectation, the code requires at least 50% of the units to be accessible.
The intent is crystal clear. The higher the expected dependency, the higher the accessibility rate.
Exactly. And even within those accessible units, there's another layer. For things like toilets and roll-in showers, only half of the required accessible units need to meet the absolute strictest technical standards. It gives the designer a bit of flexibility.
What about Group I3, detention facilities?
That's in 1108.5.5. Special holding cells and detox rooms have to be accessible. But there is an exception for cells designed specifically for suicide prevention or protective custody, where security or safety needs might override standard accessibility design.
Okay, let's shift to residential, Group R, starting with R1, hotels and motels.
For R1, it's all based on a calculation from Table 1108.6.1.1. It tells you the minimum number of accessible rooms you need based on the total number of rooms in the hotel, and also how many of those need to have roll-in showers.
So a small 75-room hotel might need 4 accessible rooms, one with a roll-in shower.
Something like that, yes. The ratio goes up as the hotel gets bigger.
Now for the big one, Group R2, apartments and dorms. This is where Type A and Type B really come together.
This is it. Section 1108.6.2.2.1 says that at least 2% of the total dwelling units have to be Type A units.
Just 2%.
Just 2%. And then the broader rule is that all the other units that are intended to be occupied as a residence that aren't required to be Type A must be Type B units.
The Type A is a small fixed percentage, and Type B is basically everything else as long as the site allows it.
That's the approach. Type B gives you really wide coverage across the housing market, but it is subject to that very important site impracticality exception.
And what about R3 and R4?
They follow similar rules. R4, which is larger residential care facilities, basically just follows the same rules as Group R2, with the same percentages for Type A and Type B units.
Okay, let's talk about where you put these units. Dispersion, Section 1108.7. What's the main rule?
The main rule is choice. Accessible units have to be dispersed among the various classes of units you offer. You can't stick all the accessible two-bedroom apartments on the ground floor next to the noisy generator room.
They have to be mixed in with the units that have different sizes, amenities, views, all of that.
All of it. They have to be distributed throughout all the options you provide to every other resident.
How does that work in a building that doesn't have an elevator?
Section 1108.7.1 covers that. In a building without an elevator, the Type A units have to be on a story that's served by an accessible route, which almost always means the ground floor. For Type B units, they have to be on the entry story of that unit.
Okay, let's tackle that site impracticality exception, 1108.7.4. When can a builder actually reduce the number of Type B units they have to provide?
This is a very high bar to clear, and for good reason. This exception lets you reduce the number of required Type B units if the site itself is so steep that it makes providing an accessible route technically impractical.
And what's the magic number for the slope?
The benchmark is a slope greater than 8.33%.
8.33%. That's the maximum slope for a ramp.
It is. If the natural grade of the site between the public sidewalk or parking and the planned front door of the building is steeper than that, the code recognizes that you have a fundamental barrier.
So if the site is that steep, you can get a reduction. But how do you figure out how big of a reduction?
It's not a judgment call. The code requires a very specific calculation. You have to figure out exactly how many of your planned units have a path to them that exceeds that 8.33% slope. That number of impractical units is then used to reduce your total required number of Type B units.
So you need an engineer and documentation to prove it.
Absolutely. You have to prove that the site itself is the problem.
Okay, we've covered housing. Let's move on to public spaces. Section 1109, assembly spaces, theaters, stadiums, places like that.
Assembly spaces are all about providing an equal experience. Section 1109.2 requires wheelchair spaces, and the number you need comes from Table 1109.2.1. It links the total number of seats to the number of wheelchair spaces you have to provide.
And this is another calculation. A small lecture hall might need 2 spaces, but a huge 2,000-seat arena needs a lot more.
Exactly. And right next to those spaces, you need companion seats, at least one regular seat next to each wheelchair space so people can sit with their friends and family.
And of course, dispersion is key again here. You can't just put all the wheelchair spots in the nosebleed section with a terrible view.
That's the heart of it. The spaces have to be dispersed to provide comparable lines of sight and access to everything. In a multi-level theater, you need wheelchair spaces on the main floor and on at least one side of any balconies or mezzanines.
Are there any exceptions to that dispersion rule?
There is one for small mezzanines in places of worship. If the seating in the mezzanine is 25% or less of the total seating, you're allowed to locate all the wheelchair spaces on the main level.
Let's talk about communication. Assistive listening systems, Section 1109.2.7.
An ALS is required anywhere that audible communication is a core part of the experience. Think courtrooms, theaters, lecture halls.
There's a table for that too.
Table 1109.2.7.1 gives you the calculation for how many receivers you need. It's usually based on the total number of seats. A small room might need 2, but a large hall requires a calculated percentage of the seats to have a receiver available.
What about judicial facilities, like courtrooms, in 1109.4?
In a courtroom, you need an accessible route to the jury box, the witness stand, and the public seating gallery.
But what about the judge's bench or the clerk's station?
Interestingly, those areas are often exempt from having a built-in accessible route from day one, provided that the space is designed so that a route could be added later without tearing the place apart.
So it's designed for future adaptability.
It is. It's a balance between security, the historical layout of courtrooms, and being ready for the future.
And what about self-service storage units?
Self-service storage facilities have to provide a certain number of accessible units based on Table 1109.3. It's usually about 5% for smaller facilities and then a formula for larger ones. And just like apartments, they have to be dispersed among the different sizes of units offered.
Okay, let's get to the fun stuff. Recreational facilities. Section 1111. Let's start with amusement rides.
Section 1111.4.1 says you need an accessible route to the boarding area of the ride. And then the ride itself has to have at least one wheelchair space or one seat that's designed for an easy transfer.
So everyone can have the same experience.
That's the goal. The only exception is for rides that are designed just for little kids, where an adult would have to help them anyway.
What about boat slips? That's an interesting one.
Boat slips in 1111.4.9 also require a calculation based on a table. For a medium-sized marina, you might need one accessible slip for every 26 to 50 slips you have. And again, they have to be dispersed among the different types of slips you offer.
Can't stick them all at the end of the dock with the worst weather exposure.
Exactly. And then there's swimming pools, section 1111.4.13.
What's the rule there?
Pools, wading pools, and spas all have to have an accessible way to get in. Usually that means at least one means of entry, like a pool lift or a sloped zero-depth entry. If the pool is really big, over 300 linear feet around the edge, you actually need two accessible entry points, and they have to be separated.
And finally, miniature golf. I bet a lot of people overlook that one.
They do, but in 1111.4.12, it says at least 50% of the holes on the course have to be accessible. That means the path to and around those holes allows for a wheelchair.
And the course itself has to have an accessible route connecting everything.
It does. The accessible holes can all be in a row as long as the last one connects back to the main path that leads to the exit or the clubhouse.
All right, let's bring it inside and focus on the day-to-day things. Section 1110, which is about restrooms, drinking fountains, and storage.
Section 1110.2, toilet and bathing facilities, is one of the core sections for any public building. The rule is that at least one toilet room or bathing room on every single floor has to be accessible.
And inside that room, everything has to comply.
Everything. The fixtures, the clear floor space, the turning space, it all has to meet the very strict technical dimensions that are laid out in ICC A117.1.
We're seeing more and more family or assisted use restrooms. How are those handled?
That's 1110.2.1. If you provide them, they have to be on an accessible route. They're designed to be bigger to accommodate a user and a helper, and they have to have at least one accessible toilet and one accessible sink.
What if you have a bank of single-user restrooms all in one spot?
If you have a cluster of them, at least 50% of those rooms have to be accessible. It's another application of that dispersion rule to make sure there's availability and choice.
Let's talk about the fixtures. For a water closet, we don't need the exact dimensions, but what are the three big things an inspector's always going to check?
Okay, first is the centerline location. The toilet has to be a specific distance from the sidewall. Second is clearances. There has to be a specific amount of clear floor space next to and in front of the toilet for approach and transfer. And third, grab bars. You absolutely have to have rear and side grab bars, and their height, length, and strength are all dictated by A117.1.
And for showers, what's the difference between a roll-in and a transfer shower?
A standard roll-in shower is bigger. It's designed so a person can roll their shower chair right in. It has to be at least 60 inches wide. A transfer shower is smaller and is designed for someone to transfer from their wheelchair onto a built-in seat. Both have very specific rules for grab bars and controls.
Okay, let's quickly cover the other features. Sinks, drinking fountains, lockers.
For sinks and kitchenettes, at least 5% of them have to be accessible. That usually means knee and toe clearance underneath and controls that are easy to use.
And drinking fountains.
That's a 50-50 rule. At least 50% of them have to be for a standing person and 50% for a wheelchair user. A lot of times you see those bi-level units that take care of both at once.
What about storage, like lockers or shelves?
Section 1110.10 says at least 5% of your storage elements have to be accessible, and importantly, they have to be dispersed. You can't just make all the bottom row lockers accessible and call it a day.
Okay, we're at the finish line. Section 1112, signage. It's often the last thing on the list, but it's so important for finding your way around.
Signage is all about identification and direction. Accessible parking signs are mandatory, of course. They have to identify the accessible spaces and show the vertical clearance for the van spots.
And signs for restrooms.
Those have to comply with A117.1, which means they need to have tactile raised letters, braille, and use the international symbol of accessibility. The ISA.
The most important signs might be the directional ones in 1112.3, the ones for when something is not accessible.
That's so true. This is for directional signage. When a primary feature isn't accessible, like a grand staircase at the main entrance, you have to have a sign with the ISA that points you toward the nearest accessible alternative, whether that's a ramp, an elevator, or an accessible restroom around the corner.
And one last thing, variable message signs in emergency situations.
Yes, in critical places like hospitals or airports, any of those big electronic signs that display emergency information have to do so in an accessible format. That makes sure everyone, including people with vision or hearing impairments, gets critical warnings and directions. So we've really gone through the entire scope of IBC 2021, Chapter 11. I think the most essential thing to take away is just how interconnected everything is. Chapter 11 is your scoping document. It sets the number and the location.
Right. It tells you need 2% Type A units or 50% accessible golf holes or a certain number of wheelchair spaces.
And the second you have that number, you have to pivot. You leave the IBC for a moment and you go straight to ICC A117.1.
Because that's the technical manual. That's where you find the ramp slope, the grab bar height, all the hard numbers. You can't comply with one without the other.
Exactly. And I'd say true mastery of this chapter really comes from understanding the nuance in the exceptions. Knowing when you can reduce Type B units because of a steep site, or when you don't need an elevator for a small mezzanine, that's just as important as knowing the basic rules.
That focus on the exceptions is so important for anyone studying. It really changes the code from just a list of rules into more of a strategic framework for design.
And if you found this breakdown helpful and you want to support us creating more content like this, where we keep analyzing these code chapters, you can visit our Patreon link, which is in the show description. Your support really does help us keep these detailed resources coming.
Thank you for navigating the codes with us today. We'll see you next time on the Code Navigators.